Hello and welcome to the Ripples of Syria. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We are grateful to our members whose generosity has made this evening's program possible. We do invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join as a member on our website. Of particular note are tomorrow's Berkeley lecture featuring Secretary Chuck Hagel and a conversation with Dr. Gary Sick on Tuesday, April 20th on Persian Gulf security issues. Learn more at irckc.org. Today we mark an anniversary none of us would have hoped to reach. A decade in, the intractable conflict in Syria shows no signs of slowing or disentangling, and ripples continue to be felt throughout Syrian society, governance, and the larger region. Tonight's discussion will help us examine where the Syrian conflict stands today, the impacts it has had on Syrian governance and society, and on neighboring states and communities, and what the prospects are in the short and medium term. We hope you'll engage with us this evening as we explore the ripples of Syria. We welcome your questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. George Kukaz is a trilingual and bicultural lawyer in the Kansas City office of Hush Blackwell, an IRC organizational member, and George is also a member of the firm's corporate and securities practice group. He's originally from Syria, and he brings a nuanced international lens to this evening's program, and we do thank him for being with us tonight. George, thanks so much. Please take it away.
Thank you, Matthew. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for this evening and for this webinar, Jomana Qaddour. Thank you for being here. By way of background, I'm just gonna give a quick bio and for background purposes for our audience. Jomana is a non-resident senior fellow with the Rafik Hariri Center and Middle East programs, where she leads the Syria portfolio. Right now, Jomana is also a doctoral student at Georgetown University Law Center, where she's focusing her studies on ethno-sectarianism and its impact on constitutional framework in Syria, Iraq, as well as Bosnia. Jomana is currently a member of the UN-facilitated Syrian Constitutional Committee, which is part of the civil society group. Jomana is also the co-founder of Syria Relief Development, which is a humanitarian organization working in the northwest of Syria. And that organization has already provided and implemented over $92 million worth of aid to the local communities in that region. Last but not least, Jomana also currently serves as the Vice Chairwoman of the American Relief Coalition for Syria, which is an umbrella group of 10 Syrian American humanitarian organizations. Jomana Qaddour, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, George.
Before I turn it back to you, Jomana, I thought for the sake of providing better context to our audience, if I may take just 5 minutes of our time tonight and pull the map of Syria and of the larger Middle East to help draw the picture for our audience. To that end, I'm going to share my screen with you all. Can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. So this is Syria. We're in the Middle East. The capital of Syria obviously is Damascus, and Damascus is in the southwest of the country. The second largest city in the country is Aleppo, which is right by the border by Turkey. And Aleppo has been an industrial powerhouse for a few decades in the country. It's noteworthy, and this is probably a topic that come up, is that the Kurds population in Syria is located in the northeast of the country, kind of around this area. and the community spread across the borders, both into Iraq as well as Turkey. So it's really around this region. In terms of neighboring countries, to the north of Syria, we've got Turkey. Turkey is a larger, more significant country in the region. Turkey is a NATO member and a US ally in the region, and is also a major player in the Middle East in terms of politically, militarily, as well as in terms of trade and economy in terms of the size of the country. On the eastern side of the country, we've got Iraq. Iraq, unfortunately, has been in the news for a couple of decades now, and as is well known, the local governance in Iraq is currently in a state of chaos, and we've got various parties trying to kind of pull things to their side and try to gain further control over the dismantling country. On the southern side of Syria, we've got Jordan. Jordan is an important ally of the United States in the Middle East, and the relationship between both Syria and Jordan has been fairly stable over the years. So there really isn't much to note in terms of cross-border state relationship between the two countries at this point. On the southern western border of Syria, we of course have Palestine and Israel. Israel and Syria have been in a state of war for decades now, and the countries have gone into wars directly against each other a number of times, really 3 times throughout the past 80 years or so. The 2 most recent times were both in 1967 as well as in 1973. As a result of the 1967 war, Israel currently occupies a small yet important region of Syria known as the Golan Heights, and is in that region over here. Last but not least is Lebanon. As you can see, Lebanon is a significantly smaller country to the west of Syria. By way of geography, Lebanon is engulfed and surrounded by Syria. Lebanon is also in a state of war with Israel, so really that border on the south is shut. You can't do much over there, and as a result of that, Lebanon has to rely on Syria for any ground transportation of goods into the country. Of course, the other way to get goods into the country is through the sea, but a good chunk of the goods will come through Syria. It's noteworthy to point that Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, is really not that far away from Damascus, the capital of Syria. It's like a 2-hour drive between the two countries, between the two capitals. And as a result of that geography, both of the capitals being close to each other, as well as the two countries being engulfed into each other, the local governance and the local political system in Lebanon has been very much influenced and, dare I say, controlled by Damascus over the years. If we zoom a tiny bit out into that larger Middle East region, we'll see that, as I mentioned earlier, we've got Turkey, which is a major player in the region to the north of Syria, but also we've got 2 other major players in the region that are really not that far away from Syria. On the one hand, we've got Iran. On the other hand, we've got Saudi Arabia. Both of these countries are major political as well as military players in the region. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, the country has a massive war chest to fund and support its foreign policies endeavors in the region. I would also note that Egypt is not too far from Syria. Egypt used to be a major player in the region back in the 1950s and 1960s, although the country has not played a significant role for, let's say, the past 20 plus years. If we zoom further out into the region, out of that region, we'll see that, whoops, too much. Okay, we'll see that Russia is also not too far away in terms of geography from Syria. It's sometimes easy to think of Russia as that big, huge countries far east on the other side of the globe, but given the size of Russia, its borders goes all the way to the Black Sea, which is really one country away from Syria. The last thing I would like to point out is to keep in mind whenever you're looking at this map or whenever you're trying to think of Syria, it's helpful to think of this country as the entry point of these major players into Europe, whether that's through the Mediterranean Sea or through Turkey. And throughout the years, Syria has played a critical and important role in providing its allies, both Russia and Iran, access to the Mediterranean Sea, which is an important factor to keep in mind when thinking about the map of the larger Middle East. With that quick introduction out of the way, Jomana, I'm gonna turn it back to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, George, for that, I think, very helpful layout and introduction. And thank you, Evan and Matthew, for having me. I was raised in the Kansas City, the greater Kansas City area. I'm from Overland Park, Kansas, went to Olathe East. So I always love opportunities to be able to give back and talk about what I do now in Washington with friends and family back home in the Midwest. And it's an honor to be alongside you, George, as a fellow, also Syrian American attorney, like myself. It's really nice to, and I want you to feel free to step in, because I am sure you also, I don't think there's a single Syrian that hasn't experienced some reverberations of the Syrian conflict. It is most definitely impacted, I think, the millions of Syrians, both that were in the country at the time and even the greater diaspora that is outside of the country. So just briefly, there's a lot that can be said about Syria. Today is what is usually marked as the 10-year anniversary, I think, of the revolution, as it was, called, I think, when it first began. And I think arguably today, many people look at what has happened in Syria with a variety of different lenses, unfortunately, given the vast toll on human life. The United Nations stopped counting the number of dead in 2016, but at the time it was about 400,000 that were identified deaths. Of course, there's many people that we have lost since then, and many deaths that were not accounted for even then at the time. There are hundreds of thousands, they say approximately 200,000, that are still in prisons inside of Syria. Their fate, many of whom their fate is unknown, some of which have died and have not, never to be heard of. There's some, I think about 10,000, whose deaths were marked over the past couple of years through a series of photos called the Caesar photos that have been displayed throughout both the United States and in Europe, of people who had died in torture under Bashar al-Assad's prisons. And then you have the millions of displaced that were displaced by a variety of different actors. I will say primarily the largest number that were bombed out of Syria, primarily by Bashar al-Assad and his allies, the Russians and the Iranians, but absolutely many of them fled due to a variety of other armed groups that sprung up throughout Syria, in Aleppo, in Damascus, in Homs, in the outskirts of Damascus, and Homs, and in other parts of the country. From Deir ez-Zor, we've all seen, the rise of ISIS, that thankfully has also been largely addressed by the coalition forces led by the United States, but that nonetheless remain present in Syria. And so with this grim picture in mind, I think there are many lessons for the international community and those of us in the United States to learn from. I think Syria had the unfortunate luck of following on the heels of the Iraq War, its neighbor, which I think remained in the minds of many people, even if the context was very different, and did play a lot into the reasons why the United States and Americans didn't want to get involved, the reasons why Syrians had mixed feelings about what to do about Syria, and we're now sort of watching the result of, I would say, major inaction by the international community that has not been able to stop the bleeding to today of what has happened in Syria. There has not been a return of refugees to the country like many had hoped. There are many still languishing in prison, as I said, approximations around 200, 100 to 200,000 that still remain in prison. And many Syrians, and especially Syrian children that have, for example, never stepped foot into a school 10 years into it, right? That are largely illiterate. There's a good number of Syrian children that are illiterate. There are many mothers that are single parent homes now as a result. and people that will never see their homes again. And I'm sure George will agree with me that in many cases, these are homes that are passed down from generation to generation, right? Like people stay a lot of times in the same neighborhoods. They buy homes closer. They may build homes right on top of their parents' homes. And they will never again, have access to those homes and that really strong social network that they had in Syria. Now, many of them, including my own family, have been displaced across Europe to places that are very foreign to them, but have at least offered them some sense of safety and stability and a chance maybe to build a new life. So that's sort of the very big picture. I'll stop there, George, and let you kind of let me know what other questions you might have had.
Yeah, for sure. So before we dig any deeper, one thought or one question I have in mind, if you can help us with, can you paint or help paint the demographic and social and religious landscape of Syria? I think it's kind of easy for people who are far away or removed from Syria to think of either Syria or really any other country as homogeneous, as all the individuals, all the citizens there belonging to the same group, and kind of paint everyone in the same brush. However, Syria, as well as the Middle East, is a very diverse area. And at least in the case of Syria, there are dozens, if not more, of religious groups as well as ethnic groups. So just for the sake of background, could you, and I know this is probably, we can spend hours talking about this, but just briefly, if you could paint the picture to us.
Sure. I mean, first of all, the tricky part is that in many Middle Eastern countries, they don't actually conduct census for political reasons. So we don't have an official census of what the landscape looks in Syria. But roughly speaking, Syria's population was about 70 to 80% Muslim prior to the outbreak of the conflict. There was about, I believe, 10 to 12% Alawis, and I believe it was about 15% that were Christian population. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But those numbers have absolutely changed since. So we're talking about pre-2011 numbers. In terms of ethnic background, Syria is a very diverse, like you said, a very diverse country. Many Kurds are Muslim, but many of them are also not Muslim. So they kind of cross over between those numbers, but I think the numbers of Kurds are about 10 to 12% also, maybe 15%, maximum, but they're distributed in Northeast Syria, where you pointed out, in Damascus and in other, small centers around. There's also a pretty, of the Christian population that I mentioned, that's about between 10 to 15%. That's obviously divided, but you have Chaldean Christians, you have Assyrian Christians, you have Greek Orthodox, you have other Orthodox communities. So even the Christian community, like many other countries in the Middle East, is quite diverse. And sometimes they even have their own little, issues between each other. I've especially seen that in the Northeast. And then you have the Alawite presence, as I mentioned, that was largely along the coast, but in the past few decades they have moved into different parts of the city centers, so into Aleppo city, into Homs city, the city of my birth, and then into Damascus city. And the reason I would say this is important is because, as many of you may know, Bashar al-Assad is from the Alawi sect, which is considered an offshoot of Shia Islam. And although he's been able to co-opt a variety of different religious and ethnic groups to work with him across the country prior to 2011, there absolutely were some sectarian motivated, I would say, massacres that happened after 2011, both Alawite against Muslim and Muslim against Alawite. We saw especially some of this in the Al-Hula massacre and some of the other massacres that happened around Homs, where you do find a lot of, Alawite and, Sunni Muslim villages, for example, next to each other. And so you've seen some of these sectarian, both sectarian and ethnic motivated, I would say, conflicts or clashes happen. And now in the past couple of years, we've, especially after October 2019, when there was a and sort of an incursion of the Turks into northeast Syria, you saw Arab Kurdish clashes break out, and we did see some of that before, but we absolutely saw it very recently, and it was of importance to the United States because the United States was supporting the SDF, which was also fighting another, a NATO ally of ours, Turkey. So it became very messy, and there is still sort of where blood has been spilled. It would be naive of us to think that that will not make reconciliation more difficult if there is ever a solution in Syria and trying to move things forward. So all of these things happened. But I will say it's important not to lose sight of the overarching conflict and the root causes of that conflict, which were, a population of all stripes. And I think it's very fair to say that Syrians of all backgrounds, ethnicities, religions did come out in March 2011 to protest the regime. And at the time, it wasn't necessarily a full call for absolute removal of the regime. It started off as calls for reform initially, and it quickly then turned into a militarized conflict that has now, the past 10 years, we see the impact of where that's come in the past 10 years, which has really been a very violent conflict, to say the least.
I know you've touched about the conflict among Muslims, mainly among Sunnis as well as Alawites. I want to ask about the repercussions of this conflict on Christians. And I see that we've got a couple of questions on this. And I think this question is even more relevant given that the Pope was in Iraq about a week or two ago, and he clearly was trying to send a message and trying to emphasize the importance of having Christians stay in the Middle East and have a role in the Middle East. How did the conflict in Syria impact Christians? Have Christians been fleeing the country at a faster rate than other religions? And in particular, I would like to touch on the role of ISIS in doing so on the one hand, but then on the other hand, the role of the regime, of the government in a way siding with religious minorities such as Christians. Could you please touch on this topic?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a very valid question, and it is very complicated, I think, for the Christian communities of Syria. As you said, I worked at the US Commission on International Religious Freedom actually for a few years, where I covered Syria, Iraq, Turkey and Egypt, and basically sort of the relationships between the majority religions and minority religions in many of these countries. So looking at the plight of Christians in Syria was something I covered and I followed intensely. I had the chance to talk to many Christian groups, leaders, many of whom lost leadership, especially in the beginning of the conflict. We had, I think we published a report on 60 leaders, Christian leaders, that were disappeared or killed by many by the Syrian regime, but also by, as you said, ISIS and by other armed groups, Al-Qaeda affiliated armed groups that found sort of the Christian communities as easy targets. But in one particular case, there was a particular priest, and I'm sorry, if I had known you were going to ask me about him, I would have had his name. I don't want to get him mixed up, but I know his first name was Yohanna Ibrahim, I believe. But he was one of he was from the Assyrian community, and he did an interview with the BBC talking about, the plight of the Christian community, sort of nudging the government to withhold itself from using violence and to try to listen to the needs of the Syrian people. And he has been disappeared ever since 2012. And he is certainly not the only one. He, like many other, religious leaders in Syria, did try to use their positions to call for peace, to call for, halting the violence, and some kind of compromise between the government and its people. And unfortunately, I've talked to his family. I'm still in touch with his family, and they absolutely suspected that the Syrian government was behind his kidnapping. In many instances, the thing is, it's very difficult to be a minority, and I'm not a minority in Syria, so I don't want to speak on behalf of the population there, but what they have told me, what I've had the chance of hearing, is that it's very difficult for them to exist in countries where, a lot of times, and you see this in different parts of the Middle East, where religious groups, religious minorities oftentimes live in, for example, there will be a whole village. It's not very far-fetched to see a whole village that is predominantly Christian, which is great because they get to see their families and their relatives, but at the same time, it makes them an easy target for any actors that want to come in and basically, for example, put a siege around the village or the city. They can easily prevent whole groups of people from a particular background from having access to the outside world. We saw this with the Christian community. We saw it also with the Ismaili community in Hama, which is also an offshoot of Shia Islam. But I've seen villages, both Christian and Ismailis, that where ISIS was about to attack it, and even though the Syrian regime forces had been encircling it, protecting it before, they withdrew, allowing ISIS to come in, but making those groups, forcing those groups to feel that the government was their only salvation, was the only entity that could protect them in the face of terrorist groups. And then you also saw, armed Muslim groups, for example, besiege Shia villages, and Iranian-backed groups besiege Sunni villages. And so, even though religion was not the primary motivator for why this conflict began, religion has absolutely been weaponized, I think, to target especially vulnerable minorities in these contexts. And I agree with you that the Syrian Christian community has been leaving Syria in much greater numbers, I think, than the rest of Syrians. I think there's, two reasons for that. One, because as you said, they were targets and easily identifiable targets easy on. We saw, it was, absolutely truth when, we saw areas that ISIS had claimed putting the letter Noon or, the N, meaning, from Christian sect, on homes where they knew there were Christians. And so they were easily identifiable targets for terrorist groups. But on top of that, I think Christians in the Middle East, even prior to the Syrian conflict, we saw this especially in Iraq, has been leaving the Middle East in greater numbers. And so a lot of these people had relatives outside of Syria that facilitated their departure. But I'm sure, like every other Syrian that's had to leave, it was not done with, it was absolutely done probably with sadness and with really sort of out of desperation and wanting, of course, to live a better life and provide better life for their children and their communities. So although many, I think there's many Syrian Christians you find in Canada, Sweden, the United States. I know in Pennsylvania nearby, there's a large Syrian Christian community. But I think that's why you see a lot more Syrian Christians that left early on and absolutely continue to leave. I mean, now in Northeast Syria, you also have problems, for example, between the Assyrian communities and the Kurds there. So the Assyrians have wanted to teach their own language, the Assyrian language, which has, been at odds, or they've struggled with some of the Kurdish leadership there. I believe this has now been worked out, but it was still a source of tension for the Assyrian community in the Northeast as well.
So today marks the 10-year anniversary of the Syrian conflict. It's been 10 years, March 15, 2011, till today. The conflict is still going on. Could you please, and also briefly, given that this is a very dense topic, to highlight the major milestones in that conflict, and in particular, if you can please focus on the Syrian conflict in connection with the Arab Spring when it first started. We've got a few questions relating to that. Was the Syrian conflict the result of the Arab Springs, and can we relate or think of that event as part of a larger effect, which is the Arab Spring that took place in late 2010, early 2011?
Sure. I mean, I absolutely believe, I think we all watched, Egypt unfold in early, January 25th, 2011 of that year. We saw Libya, the protests in Libya happened, Bahrain at the time, and Syria was absolutely one of the countries where you saw millions of people come out. Initially, actually, it wasn't millions. I mean, you saw Syrians had never protested against the regime in this way ever. I mean, you have to think of a country that civil society was non-existent in Syria, not out of lack of desire or want. It was because Syria was a police state. I visited Syria, many years until 2011. I think I saw that in some of our questions and answers, people had gone. And as long as you didn't criticize the Syrian government, you were fine. You could go on with your life. But the country was largely, moving up in the country largely had to do with wasta, or who you knew, who could help you move up and elevate. Members of parliament weren't there making their own independent decisions. In fact, the Ba'ath Party was the only party allowed, even by law, until 2012, when the constitution on paper modified this law. I believe it was Article 8 in the Syrian constitution, but in practice has not actually changed. I mean, there haven't been practical, impact of the change or modification of the constitution. And so it was, I think akin to something like North Korea, slightly more open in terms of people being able to go in and out. But in terms of its political orientation, it was very much, you didn't go there to have, political debates by any means. I think the brave people that went out into the streets in March initially did seek to keep it as a peaceful protest. I mean, there are many stories of activists who would go around and have bottles of water with roses on them and give them to the policemen or the military that Bashar al-Assad had sent to surveil these protests. And the people then were trying to show, like, listen, I'm Syrian, you're Syrian, there's no need for you to kill me. Here's a bottle of water. Like, we all need more freedom. We all need the right to speak, to have the, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. I mean, these are things that all of us can benefit from. But unfortunately, the regime was not built on, a system that allowed for political discussion, political, even in terms of innovation. Like I said, I mean, even, school systems there, you were raised within the Ba'athist system, which is very a military mindset at a young age. And so, I think many people went out there hoping that the government would actually acquiesce to some of these things, maybe in some way that we saw how Hosni Mubarak stepped down. They thought that they would be met with that kind of compromise. And unfortunately, we saw Bashar al-Assad use violence almost immediately by mid-2011 to the end of 2011. The city of Homs, which is actually the city of Bashar al-Assad's wife, was bombarded, and armed groups began to pop up, initially out of self-defense, and then we saw the conflict sort of spiral out of control from there.
I would like to focus on a particular group for a few minutes, and that's the Kurds, really because, and we were talking about this before this event, the Kurds had a very unfortunate life over the past few decades in the region. We've had a number of countries preventing them from getting a state that's their own. So I would like to just focus a bit on the Kurds. Can you tell us about the role of the Kurds in Syria and the history of the Kurds in the region? As we mentioned earlier, the Kurds in Syria are mainly located in the northeastern side of the country, but they're also in the outskirts of my hometown, Aleppo, as well as near the capital, Damascus. So could you please tell us a bit about the Kurds? And in particular, I think this is worthy of discussion in terms of US foreign policy towards Syria. The US has played a fairly important role initially at supporting the Kurds, or at least sending them weapons with the hope of them defending themselves against ISIS. Can you please tell us more about this?
Sure. Listen, I think the Kurds are an important minority in Syria. And I'll start off by saying that pre-2011, to be a Kurd in Syria was not an easy thing. In many instances, especially in the Northeast, the government actually, they criminalized speaking the Kurdish language. They weren't entitled to citizenship. They were, marginalized in political life. and even in many of their own like social and in meeting any of the needs of their own nationhood. And so it was really to be a Kurd in Syria, like I said, was very difficult prior to 2011. When the conflict broke out, shortly thereafter, the regime, sort of looking at the different groups, decided to give the Kurds, not all of them, but many of them, citizenship finally. Like many of them had been arrested before, and so there was some some efforts by the regime to try to stop them from rebelling against the regime, thinking that this would be enough to stop them from opposing the regime. It was not, obviously, because the Kurds, like all other Syrians, wanted more than the very few crumbs that the regime was willing to give, if anything. I mean, the regime wasn't really willing to compromise on anything, but even the giving citizenship to Kurds was not enough, considering what they wanted, what things they aspired to obtain. They like you said, the sort of the major concentration of Kurds is in the northeast, and as they sought to sort of protect their people, they did develop a fighting force that is now known as the Syrian Democratic Forces. It's not just Kurds, it's mixed Kurds and Arabs. It is largely led by Kurds. A lot of the leadership is Kurdish, and some of it some of it is made up of not necessarily all positions. It's a bit more complicated. I won't go into that in detail here, but the major issue that Turkey has with the SDF is the fact that it contains cadres and individuals from the PKK, the Kurdistan People's Party, I believe. You can it's a different name in Kurdish. The Workers' Party, Kurdistan Workers' Party, I believe, that is designated as a terrorist group both in Turkey and the United States for its actions in Turkey and the use of violence, sort of to achieve some of its means. But I wouldn't paint I think the overwhelming number of Kurds in northeast Syria with that brush. I think many of them desired what many average Syrians also wanted. They saw their hometowns of Kobani, which was a Kurdish-dominated area, fall to ISIS. That's when the United States got involved back in 2015, when the coalition got involved, and we've seen since then, other cities, major Kurdish-dominated cities then fall either to Turkish forces or regime forces. Like Afrin was a Kurdish-dominated city that is now largely under Turkish control. But in the areas where the Kurds dominate, they have been trained, and they are the primary partner for the United States on the ground when it came to defeating ISIS. Like I said, it's not fully Kurdish. There are Arabs that are part of those forces, and in some cases they're arguably more in number, although defined, very much so by Kurdish leadership. But those partners really helped us. Us and the coalition were from the air, but they really helped us clear out ISIS from the ground. They are now also, we have about 10 to 12,000 ISIS fighters that are held in prisons in northeast Syria that are also being imprisoned there by the SDF. And this became an issue when the Turkish incursion happened in October 2019, because there was not enough forces there on the ground to both push back on the Turkish push to come into northeast Syria, as well as to also cover, the many ISIS fighters that are in prison, and that I think it's in the international community's interest to keep imprisoned until, Europe decides what it wants to do with its foreign fighters, and what I think the international community decides to do even about the Syrian and Iraqi fighters that fought with ISIS. Listen, I think the Kurds now, they've, and I probably shouldn't use the word Kurds. It's probably more accurate to say the SDF / the SDF and its political arm, the Syrian Democratic Council, the SDC, that have more or less some sort of autonomy in northeast Syria. And the regime has been trying to regain access to this land, because in this land you have Syria's most important resources. Syria's oil fields are located here. The breadbasket of Syria is here. Raqqa is also part of this greater area, the dam that, where a lot of Syria's water comes from here. And so it's absolutely on the radar of the regime, as well as its allies, Russia and Iran, to get those resources back and flowing into regime-held areas, into government-held areas. So they're in a very difficult spot right now. Of course, there's calls for, we saw this during the campaign season. A lot of people want America out of Syria. The American force there is quite negligible compared to, I think, for example, we saw 100,000 troops, American troops in Iraq. In Syria, you have 750 troops, a very small number of special forces that are there providing, an advisory capacity mostly, and helping sort of protect and work with our partners until a more lasting solution is identified. But, it would be, the Kurds are, in a very tough position, both between Turkey and between the Syrian government and its allies. And like I told you, there's a lot of Syrian Christians that live in that area, Arab tribes that live in that area, as well as Kurds. So it's a very sensitive part of Syria where Kurds are located.
In the interest of time, I was going to ask about refugees and the spread of refugees both in the Middle East as well as into Europe and the Northern Americas. But in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that topic only because we've been getting quite a few questions about kind of, if we zoom a tiny bit out and think on a broader scope, on a larger scope, when we're thinking about the role of the US as well as the larger international community in helping and addressing the issue in Syria. And my first question is going to be, what has the US done or failed to do, both the US as a country as well as a leader of the Western world, and as well as Europe? What have they done or failed to do in bringing a solution to the Syrian conflict? And as well as, on the other hand, I would like to talk about the role of Russia and China to a lesser extent in kind of pushing in a different direction in terms of bringing an ending to the Syrian conflict.
Sure. Okay, I'll try to address that very briefly. I see a couple of comments here about America's inaction, and I think that's absolutely correct. I think in the Syrian context, it wasn't American invasion that destroyed Syria. It was, I do think it was America's taking a step back and really letting, I think, Russia and, as you said, China and Iran play a role, a very big role in shaping the Syrian conflict dynamics. I think there were opportunities lost. I think the red line is one of them. I think that's been discussed at length, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. But there is sort of not sort of, but there was an understanding that chemical weapons would not be used against civilians. And the Syrian conflict, we saw in August 2013, the deaths of almost 1,800 people in Douma. In Ghouta, excuse me, and many people perished as a result of the use of chemical weapons. Russia stepped in, Obama asked Congress, and Russia stepped in and said, basically, we're going to get the regime to surrender its chemical weapons. And chemical weapons have been used at least 200 times since that supposed surrender. Obviously, the regime didn't give up all of its weapons. There were many arsenals that were not announced to the OPCW. Some chemical weapons that got into the hands of ISIS, some chemical weapons that got into the hands of the Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, and were used on civilian populations. But it's very important to note that the Syrian regime has itself used chemical weapons repeatedly, like I said, at least 200 times since. And so that was our inaction then, as well as even from the beginning, I think has really helped signal to actors like Russia and China and Iran that we did not have the desire to do anything to really push back on those who've stood by Bashar al-Assad and perpetuated the oppression and the killing and the detention of innocent civilians in this conflict. I also think one of our biggest mistakes, and we being the United States, is that we wanted to constantly look at it as a political conflict. And I recently saw Robert Ford say this, who was the ambassador at the time in Syria when the conflict started. And he said, our problem was that we always looked at this as a political conflict, where Bashar al-Assad and Russia have always viewed this as a military conflict. They sought to use arms from the start, and they were not willing to discuss. They weren't there. All of the rounds, the political rounds, negotiation rounds they had in Geneva, the regime was never actually there to negotiate. They were there mostly to delay any progress in the political file, and to sort of tie up the international community in what we thought were going to be negotiations in good faith. And I think the reality is that they never were negotiations in good faith. And I can tell you, as a member of the UN Constitutional Committee, now as a member of the civil society group that is being tasked with drafting a new constitution for Syria, we've had 5 rounds since October 2019, and we have had no progress at all. And that's in big part due to the fact that the members who are coming from Damascus to Geneva to negotiate have not been given any mandate to actually negotiate anything. They want the sanctions removed. They want reconstruction aid, but they're not willing to do anything at all to make that happen. And the UN Special Envoy Geir Peterson did a press conference after the last round in Geneva, where you could just feel his exasperation, because he really has tried his best to move this forward. And he's asked for some confidence building measures from the Syrian government in particular. There's about 900 Syrian children under the age of, I believe, 10 that are in prison. And he's asked the regime, as a confidence building measure, could you please at least release these children under 10? And the regime refused to release even one of them. And so it's really, these are just, if you ask why the Syrian conflict hasn't moved forward, it's really the lack of sincere desire to give up anything in exchange for finally ending this conflict and letting people come home.
I have one more question before we end this webinar. What do you think about the future? Can you give us any glimpse of hopes on the future of Syria? We've been in this conflict for 10 years. There has been massive destruction across the country.
Sure.
Hundreds of thousands of people have left the country, and millions of people have relocated internally. The economy is fully devastated. The infrastructure is basically on the ground. The country is isolated politically as well as economically in the region and in the world. Any glimpse of hopes for the future of Syria, both politically and socially?
Although I'm an optimist, it's been very hard for me to see sort of a light forward. And it's very hard to say that. I don't think it's easy. We always assume, especially like in America, we always assume there must be a solution to everything. And I think right now it's very hard to see light in the immediate and possibly even medium term. There were a couple of people asking about, what they can do to help. If I'm allowed to do one shameless plug, I'm the co-founder of a nonprofit humanitarian organization that's been working in Idlib, where about 4 million people people who have been displaced about 6 or 7 times are residing. There are some who live in blankets, live in tents. They're always constantly under threat of an offensive from the government and the Russians. And they also, there is the terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in the same general area that does try to silence these people's voices. But we do work there. We're called Syria Relief and Development. That's one tangible way. I can tell you that one thing that makes me happy is that, the capacity of Syrians to build institutions and organizations has really, it's been such an honor to watch. You have, like I said in the beginning, this was a country that had no civil society, to now you have hundreds of civil society groups, both inside of Syria and the region and in Europe. We have I know so many Syrians in Europe that didn't just go to Europe and, start a completely new life and turn, the chapter, turn the page on a new chapter. Many of them have been trying to help, new Syrian refugees adjust. They've been learning languages, trying to educate their own publics wherever they may be on what's happening there. They've been trying to really, look at very, very difficult questions about how to, for example, assist women inside of Syria, even in government-held areas, about how to get them aid if they're I know lawyers who work very much under the radar that are helping women who are, for example, abused, or people that have lost their homes, and how to try to address some of those grievances. So it's really been impressive to see a population that has been through so much try to continue to give back and do a lot for their own people. Another thing that I think is really does give some sense of hope is that there is finally now trials that have been taking place primarily in Europe to try to hold to account people who perpetrated war crimes. We finally saw the first guilty verdict take place about 3 weeks ago for a man who committed war crimes against 30 people, and who testified these were people inside of, and it's, George knows, like it's actually difficult. Even if you have your universal jurisdiction, you need to have the perpetrator of the crime in that state. You also need to have the victims in that state, and to be able to launch this investigation and this trial. And they were able to find all three of those elements in, for example, in Germany, and they caught the perpetrator, and he's now been tried. And I think, you can't ever bring back the dead, those missing. You can't, you can't undo the last 10 years and take away that pain. But I do absolutely think this gave some sense of justice to Syrians that have not seen any justice, especially those who, for example, survived torture in prisons for years, and sexual violence, all different kinds of torture, saw their families, expelled, and so this gave them hope that there are countries in Europe and countries like ours who do have the rule of law, and that this is being documented now, I think, in these courts, to forever be part of like that history, that it is documented somewhere and it's being acknowledged that this happened, that those people are entitled to some restitution, whatever that restitution may be. But I think these kinds of trials will go a long way, especially in sort of a post-conflict scenario, because I think if we try to move into a post-conflict scenario with no sense of truth, reconciliation, rehabilitation of society, you very much can spiral back into that civil war mentality. And so I think people, when they see this, they think, if they see someone who perpetrated crimes against them, instead of, taking justice into their own hands, as we've seen in other conflicts, they can then deliver that person to the authorities, and they might have some, however small, some sense of solace that justice is being served. And so I think these two things in particular are very important. I have seen many Syrian refugees, make a new life, get education, and really be able to contribute. I have many friends, for example, who are, came here as refugees, are now physicians at Harvard. They are, they've been, leading all kinds of organizations. I know one who wants to run for office in Canada. I mean, I've seen really remarkable stories. And I think many of them now are busy documenting their own experiences so that they could build that historical record. So in hopes that maybe this can be avoided again. I know we say never again after World War II, and unfortunately it has happened again. But I think they still feel obligated to try and do what they can for this not to occur to another people.
Jomana, thank you very much. And I know we still have so many other questions left unanswered, so I do apologize to our audience. As you know, this is such a dense topic that we could spend days talking about it and still not be able to fully address it. I hope that we won't get to celebrate the 11th anniversary of this conflict, although unfortunately it looks like this conflict is gonna keep going for a long time, and damage is spreading and people are suffering. But Jomana, with that said, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the very interesting discussion you provided to us. And Matthew, I'll turn it back to you.
Jomana and George, I'm just really grateful for the thorough and nuanced job that you did of unpacking a very, very complex situation. When folks talk to us about Syria at the International Relations Council, one of the words that they use very often is complex, that it's just, it's such a knot and it's difficult to understand. And obviously we could spend a lot more time, but just really, really grateful, Jomana, to you and to George for your careful threading of this conversation. Jomana, please come and visit us in Kansas City when you can. We love having Kansas speakers, and so we're grateful to you.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was wonderful to speak to you, George. And just if I may say one thing, you know, to many people who are asking what they can do. You know, like I said, there's a lot of humanitarian organizations that are working in Idlib, even in government-held areas that are trying to deliver aid very discreetly to people who need it. I didn't get a chance to mention this, but the lira has dropped to 4,000 liras per dollar. And you compare that to a pre-war number of 50 liras per dollar. So major inflation. People can't find bread, they can't find oil, gas, very basic staples. And there is no end in sight to this. So humanitarian aid is absolutely necessary. But, you know, I know many of you guys are involved in local politics, and it's really important to tell your congressmen and senators, you know, to continue to give the Syrian conflict the attention it deserves. And I absolutely do think there's still room for the United States to help and to see this through. So if you could, you know, write your own representatives, I don't think it's done. And I don't think the reverberations of the conflict will end even if we decide to walk away. So it's best to be engaged. And I think that there's a lot that the US can still do and contribute to hopefully lead Syria back on a positive path. So thank you so much for having me.
Jomana, thank you, and we look forward to staying in touch. George, thank you, and thanks to all of our viewers and members this evening. We do invite you to continue the conversation at irckc.org. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you again very soon.